Welcome to AEN's 7th Regional Short Course in Miami, Florida. For those joining online, thank you so much for your participation. I'm Miriam Elman. I'm AEN's Executive Director. And in the room are several of my colleagues in the AEN leadership team, along with faculty members from across the state of Florida and across the country. We're spending 3 days together engaging on AEN's issues, networking, learning about current Israeli and Palestinian politics and developments in the Middle East, and working together to develop strategies for countering anti-Semitism on campus and in the academy. It's really a great pleasure to be able to open this keynote to our larger membership and to our partners and to supporters. And we're delighted to have with us Michal Tamir, who will speak to us on what is certainly a very timely topic: the Constitution of Israel, a story of compromises. Michal is an associate professor at the Academic Center of Law and Science, an adjunct professor in the law school at Bar-Ilan University. Her research focuses on the intersection of law and society. She's written several important books in Hebrew and many articles in English and Hebrew, and is frequently cited by Israel's Supreme Court. This year, she is a visiting professor at the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley Law School. And you can read more about her many awards and all her accomplishments from her bio in your program. And Michal will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to comments and questions from the floor. Those on Zoom are, of course, welcome to stay on through the entire Q&A. Although you will be on listen and view mode only. And Michal, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope it will be more as a conversation. We'll try to do it like that, but I'll start by sharing my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, can you see it? Can you see it, Liam? Can you just...
Yes. Sorry,
okay.
yeah, I muted them.
Okay, thank you. So
Gotcha.
almost always when I tell people that I teach Israeli constitutional law, they ask me, how do you teach constitutional law when Israel doesn't have a constitution? So let's start from the end. In Israel, there are today basic laws that function as a constitution. It is a partial and uneven constitution, and definitely a unique one. My purpose is to tell you about the processes and compromises that led to this unique situation. This is a long story, and the process was gradual, incremental, piecemeal, and contingent. So we will start our journey by, United Nations resolutions number 181. Okay, so the United Nations resolution was that they voted actually for the establishment of a Jewish state, but the plan was that 3 political entities would be established in Palestine: a Jewish state, an Arab state, and a special international regime for Jerusalem. So part of this resolution was that the Constituent Assembly of each state shall draft a democratic constitution for its state and choose a provisional government. So we see that actually 2 states were supposed to be established, a Jewish state and an Arab state, and both should have been democratic with a constitution. However, this decision was accepted by the national leadership of the Jewish people who lived in Palestine, but the Arab rejected the legitimacy of the new Jewish state. And on May 15, 1948, the British mandate was supposed to terminate, and it was very important to avoid a political vacuum. And therefore, in 3 weeks, the declaration of the establishment of Israel was drafted. And on Friday, 14th of May, 1948, one day before the termination of the British mandate, the body who served as a parliamentary body, the People's Council, confirmed, published, and signed the Declaration of Independence that I asked you to read. So this is the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel. And let's think about what are the components of this declaration. The declaration had actually 3 parts. There is an historical part that actually describes the justification for the establishment of the State of Israel. There is an operative part, which is very important to our discussion, determination of the principal organs of the state, and a declarative part, the character of the new state, its principles appeal to the United Nations, the Arabs, the Jews, and the neighboring states. So I'm gonna go back to the declaration to show you the parts. So I hope you will be able to see the first component is the historical component, and it starts with in Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, with the birthplace of the Jewish people, etc. This is the first part. Now I want to focus on the operative part, which is we declare that with effect from the moment of the termination of the mandate being tonight, until the establishment of the elected regular authorities of the state in accordance with the Constitution, which will be adopted by the elected Constituent Assembly, the People's Council shall act as a provisional council for the state, and its executive organ, the People's Administration, shall be the provisional government of the Jewish state to be called Israel. So this section is very operative. It says which are the provisional legislature and governance. It says that there is a provisional legislature which called the Provisional Council. There is a provisional government, and there should be a Constituent Assembly. The task of the Constituent Assembly is to constitute a constitution, and the task of the Provisional Council is to be the provisional legislature. Both of these bodies are temporary because the Constituent Assembly should be dissolved once it's finished the task of creating the constitution, and the Provisional Council should be dissolved once a permanent legislature would be elected according to the new constitution. So this is the operative part, and the third part is the vision of Israel. The state of Israel will be open to Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles and so on. Okay, so before we ask if the declaration itself can be perceived as a constitution, can someone tell me what are usually the components of a constitution? What is the role of constitution? So what did you say? That there is a preamble and?
Articles.
And what do the articles include?
Institutions of government, amendment process, limitations of government. Bill of Rights.
Okay, okay, that is very correct. Constitutions usually include actually the governmental structure, Bill of Rights, and basic values and commitments. So if it's a federal state, of course, the division of powers between the central government and the subunits, the basic institutional structure, legislative, executive, judicial powers, the relations between them. Of course, usually constitution include Bill of Rights, human rights, and civil rights, and the identity of the state. And the role of constitution, it was said, is actually constitutionalism is the idea that government can and should be legally limited in its powers. And the main function of a constitution is to create the basic agreements, which are the rule of the games, or the basic values that are distinguished from the regular politics. The rule of the games are the shared part which gives society coherence and identity. Does someone know what is the mechanism to achieve those goals? How can we do it as something that is the rule of game that is outside the day-to-day politics? What are the mechanisms that constitutions use?
Norms, non-legal norms, like in a English system of where you have parliamentary supremacy.
Okay, so how can we? What is the mechanism to make it not as the British or English system?
Well, the British system's working pretty okay.
It's PowerPoint.
Yes, it's the enumerated powers, the listed and enumerated powers.
Okay, I'll answer the question.
It's the one in the blank on the bottom.
The characteristics of constitution is rigidity. The norms imposing limits upon government power must be some degree entrenched. So as the United States Constitution, that it's very difficult to change because it's entrenched. That's how you make it super norms and not regular norms. That's how you make it norms that are outside the day-to-day politics, that you cannot change with the change easily with the change of governance. And the second mechanism is superiority. The Constitution is the supreme norm, and regular legislation receives its validity with compliance with the Constitution. So again, as you see in the United States, if law is invalidates the Constitution and in an unconstitutional way, the Supreme Court can invalidate it. So, and also, at least until now, it is the same in basic law with in Israel, and we'll speak about it. So this is the characteristic of constitution, and based on this, we can ask now: can the declaration be perceived as a constitution? Can someone tell me why yes or why no?
If you just take the capital C, you'll make it a lowercase c, that moves the ball forward.
They don't have capital letters in Hebrew.
Oh, good point.
I don't hear you.
The one problem we're having here is we're coming from an American paradigm where we have a constitution with a capital C, where if you look at a British system, you have a constitution with a lowercase c, but they're both constitutions. Yeah.
But can the declaration be perceived as a constitution?
Well, that's not what declarations do. I mean, declarations declare international, existence, in international law. If you read the American Constitution as declaration, it just says we're independent from England. And it doesn't set up the domestic politics.
Okay.
In fact, it was 15 years later, right?
But why can't the declaration be a constitution?
Okay. I understood the answer. The declaration is usually declare the establishment of state and not the constitution. Move to the. Can you see the next slide? Can the declaration be perceived as constitution?
Yes.
Okay, so there are reasons to say yes, because this is our declaration declares who is the legislative authority, the provisional council of the state. It declares who is the executive authority. It includes Bill of Rights, and it declares the vision of the state. However, the declaration expressly declares that the constitution will be adopted by the elected Constitutional Assembly. So the declaration, our declaration, the Israeli declaration actually says very clear that it is not a constitution, because a constitution would be established by a constituent assembly. So before I will deal with the question whether what did the Supreme Court say, let's see what were the processes that led to the fact that actually there was no constitution. I mean, notwithstanding that the declaration was really very clear about creating a constitution, actually a constitution was not established. And so the People's Council, which was the representation of the the Jewish people in Palestine, declared the Declaration of Independence. That was the first issue. And then the Provisional Council of the state, which is the temporary legislature, its first act was the Law and Administration Ordinance, which actually said what we have already know, that the Provisional Council is the legislature. But here comes a very important issue, which is an act that's called the Transition Order from 1949. In this act, in this law, actually, the Provisional Council dissolved itself and transformed all its powers to the Constituent Assembly. Okay? So now a body with two powers was created: a constituent authority, that is authority to adopt the Constitution by virtue of the Declaration, and legislative authority by virtue of the Transition Order. So, and that the original role of the Constituent Assembly to adopt the Constitution was blurred by the Transition Order, and hence the name putsch was attached to it. So actually in this act, again, the Provisional Council dissolved itself, transferred all its powers to the Constituent Assembly, and now we have one Constituent Assembly with the power to create a constitution and with the power to enact regular laws. And what was the law of the first law of the Constituent Assembly? The Transition Act that actually said that the legislative body will call the Knesset, and the Constituent Assembly will be the first Knesset. So the Constituent Assembly became the first Knesset. So that's how actually, okay, a body with two powers was created. The Constituent Assembly, which was the first Knesset, it had a constituent power by virtue of the Declaration of Independence and legislative power by virtue of the Transition Order. And there was no argument that the first Knesset had its authority to create a constitution that was not actually, it was very clear. But the serious debate was surrounded the question whether it had to do so. And what do you think could be the arguments against constitution? What do you think? Why do you think there were people against the constitution?
Because of religious reasons. Religious reasons, because they claim that the Torah is our constitution.
I cannot.
Religious reasons.
The Torah is the Constitution, religious reasons.
Okay, there were religious reasons. Yes, that's true. And what are the reasons of the coalitions of David Ben-Gurion's against the constitution?
Well, if you have to ask if it ain't broke, why fix it? What was broken about the first Knesset that would have impelled people to fix it? I mean, there may be people who are perfectly content with the allocation of power or resources in the first Knesset. So why would you want to change it? Why would those people want to change it?
Well, Ben-Gurion was also a very powerful prime minister, and I think he was almost an absolute. Basically was a one-party system. Only, the Likud, then not even Likud, Peru was 7%. I don't think he wanted to be second guessed. But the La Granada changed it in the case of Colam that Doron mentioned. But yes, the constitution was very weak until La Granada stepped in. Correct, Doron?
Everything you say is correct.
Yeah. Almost.
Almost. Okay, we go to this slide. So what was the reason for objection to a written constitution? So there was really the coalition's objection. They said, well, you see, we have the British tradition of parliament sovereignty that you already mentioned. See, Great Britain, they do great without a constitution. Also, they said that it is undesirable to establish a rigid constitutional principles when most of the nation had yet to immigrate to Israel. How can we, the minority of Jews in Israel, decide the rule of the games for like the Jews that are in the diaspora and yet to come? But I think the more important, the real reasons are those two. One is avoiding the struggle between political parties and social segments that might lead to a cultural war. And the other thing is reluctance to judicial review. They had, by the Supreme Court, they had a new state to establish with so many problems, with the security problems, with the inside and outside, and they didn't want the Supreme Court to tell them what to do. And there were also the religious parties' objection that said, well, Israel had a constitution, the Torah, and also, and this is the main thing, a Bill of Rights will change the status quo that maintains Jewish civilization. And as you know, till nowadays, in Israel, there is no civil marriage. The rabbinical court have exclusion jurisdiction over marriage and divorce in Israel. And that is so important for them, and they will not risk it. So that was the objection from the religious part. Now, on the other hand, there was, as someone mentioned here, Menachem Begin was the head of the opposition. He was in favor of constitution, and he said that the establishment of a constitution is the basis act in the process of nation becoming a sovereign state. And very important, we need to respect the international commitments to establish a constitution. Again, I want to remind you, it was the United Nations resolution to establish a Jewish state that would be democratic state with a constitution. And he also said democracy is not only the governance of the majority, but also the protection of minorities' rights, for which the Constitution has a principal role. So, as you see, they couldn't agree. And now we get to the first compromise. So the first Knesset couldn't agree about the constitution, and they received the Harari compromise, which means constitution by stage. So now we jump to the Harari compromise. The Harari resolution, which says, the first Knesset assigns to the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee the preparation of a proposed constitution for the state. The constitution will be made up of chapters, each of which will constitute a separate basic law. The chapters will be brought to the Knesset as the committee completes its work, and all of the chapters together will constitute the constitution of the state. So this was not, this is not a law. This was a decision of the Knesset named after the Knesset member who proposed it, is Harari. And it is very vague and left many open questions. When would the constitution be completed? What would be the normative status of the basic laws? Would the basic laws be superior to regular laws? Would they be entrenched? Would the constitution be binding only after its completion, or would each basic law have a constitutional standing and be normative above ordinary legislation? All those questions were left. And actually, the first Knesset was dissolved by transferring all its powers to the next Knesset without accepting any basic law. Actually, the first basic law was enacted by the third Knesset. So basic law, the Knesset, was prepared by the second Knesset and was passed in the third Knesset. And until 1992, 9 basic laws were accepted, most of them institutional now. None of them dealing with Bill of Rights. Basic law, the Knesset, basic law, the government, basic law, the judiciary, basic law, the president of the state, basic law, the Israel Defense Forces, basic law, the state comptroller, basic law, the state economy, basic law, Israel lands, and basic law, Jerusalem. Now, in the absence of Bill of Rights, people tried to argue before the Supreme Court that the Declaration of Independence should be a constitution. Because, remember, the declaration had the third part, which said that Israel will be open for Jewish immigration, and it will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, and envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, culture. And so people try to go to the Supreme Court and say, hey, this law infringes upon, for example, my right to equality. And the declaration is our constitution, and the declaration said that equality is a principle or a right in the Jewish state. So please invalidate this law. And the Supreme Court didn't accept this. The Supreme Court said that the declaration expresses the vision and credo of the people, but it is not a constitutional law making a practical ruling on the upholding or nullification of various ordinances and statutes. So The Supreme Court said that the Declaration is the vision and credo of the people. As much as we will interpret laws in the spirit of the Declaration, but we can't invalidate a law that infringe upon the Declaration. So I will skip the example and go to to sum the situation before 1992. So the situation before 1992, it was that Israel followed the British tradition, sovereignty of parliament. The declaration could not be the basis for invalidations of laws. The declaration was a very powerful tool for the interpretation of law. As far as possible, laws were interpreted in the spirit of the rights and values of the declaration, but the basic laws had no normative superiority. And now we come to the next compromise. So in 1992, two basic laws were enacted. Basic law, human dignity and liberty, and basic law, freedom of occupation. Basic law, human dignity and liberty speaks about the rights of every human being to life, human dignity, liberty, the right to live and enter the country, privacy and property, and basic law, freedom of occupation, the right of every citizen or permanent residents to engage in any occupation, profession, or trade. And why wouldn't the Knesset agree on adopting a full Bill of Rights? I will answer the question because we don't have time. So, as you understand, there were many constitutional rights that were controversial. The main one is equality. There was religious parties concerned regarding who would be defined as a Jew, the possible invalidation of the exemption of ultra-Orthodox for military service, a state recognition of non-Orthodox stream of Judaism. They were afraid also from freedom of speech that could create a validation of pornography. Religious freedom. The Orthodox were afraid of changing the status quo. And of course, fear of judicial review. So now we actually come to the second compromise, or second main compromise that said that was atomization or division into components rather than a full Bill of Rights. We will not enact a full Bill of Rights. We will choose only several less controversial rights and submit them as a separate basic laws, while tossing out the controversial rights such as equality, freedom of expression, freedom of religious. Also part of the compromise was that the two basic laws will anchor the Jewish nature of the state by specifying that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. And a very important thing is that all arrangements existing before basic law, human dignity and liberty are immunized, and thus former religious arrangements are protected even if they contradict the basic law. So if I ask you to read basic law, human dignity and liberty, I don't have time to show it now, but section 10 says actually immunize all the arrangements that were enacted before 1992, before the creation of basic law, human dignity. And that's, for example, the law that gives the rabbinical court exclusive jurisdiction is immunized. You can't touch it, you can't invalidate it. And what is actually the innovation of these basic laws? Because someone mentioned Kol Ha'am. Actually, the Supreme Court created human rights without Bill of Rights. And human rights and civil rights were recognized in Israel even before 1992. And we also know that we had former 9 basic laws before 1992. So what is the big innovations in those laws that we call it a constitutional revolution? The innovation was that there is a limitation clause, which is Section 8 in Basic Law Human Dignity and Liberty and Section 4 in Basic Law Freedom of Occupation, that said there shall be no infringement of rights under the Basic Law except by a law befitting the values of the State of Israel, enacted for a proper purpose and to an extent no greater than required. So that means what if a law infringe upon a right anchored in the law, in the basic laws, and doesn't meet those demands? And the answer was given in Bank HaMizrahi case, which is actually our Marbury versus Madison. In Bank HaMizrahi case, the Supreme Court dealt with this question and said that the Knesset is empowered with the constituent authority. With that authority, the Knesset enacted a constitution for Israel. It did so chapter by chapter in accordance with the Harari resolution. Each of the basic laws constitutes a chapter in the constitution of the State of Israel. Each chapter stands at the head of the normative pyramid. That's the State of Israel and the Constitution, the basic laws. And that means that all 11 basic laws, and today actually there are 13, were declared retroactively as normatively superior as part of the Constitution. So nowadays, actually, there is we used to show. I used to show students the pyramid, the normative and institutional pyramid of Hans Kelsen, which show the institution and the norms. So, in a democratic state, the sovereign is are the people. And the people give the and then the higher institution is the Constituent Assembly, and the constituent and lower institution is the legislature, then the governance, and each institution gets its power from the higher institution, and each norm gets its validity from compliance from the higher norm. So laws need to comply with the Constitution, secondary legislation with laws and the Constitution, and so on. Even the people, when we create norms like wills or contracts, we need to comply with all other norms. So nowadays in Israel, the Knesset has actually 2 hats. The Knesset is a constituent assembly and a legislature. And when the Knesset wears the hat of constituent assembly, it creates basic laws. When it wears the hat of legislature, it creates laws. And the basic laws are functioning as a constitution. And the Knesset can actually limit itself as a legislature. When the Knesset creates a basic law, it can limit itself and acting as a legislature. So I will quickly sum up that our basic laws function as a constitution in terms of normative supremacy. But it's a very unique constitution because it is not one unitary document. It is very partial because there is no basic law legislation. We can't really know how we create constitution, how we create there is no like rules how you really accept basic law. And it's very partial because not all human rights are anchored explicitly. It is uneven because some basic laws are rigid and in the sense of a special majority that required for amendment. For example, basic law freedom of occupation states explicitly that it should be amended only by basic law passed by majority of the members of the Knesset. So it means that to amend basic law freedom of occupation, you need at least 61 Knesset members. But basic law, human dignity and liberty can be amended only by regular majority. So it's very uneven. And I hope that this explains why there are some, nowadays there are so many, there a big debate about amendments of basic law, because it's so easy to amend basic law. And the new coalition in Israel has now many new ideas about amendments of basic laws. So I'll finish here, and I hope we still have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Michal, for walking us through the history and the formation of the Declaration and then the basic laws. I'm sure that everybody in the audience has a lot of questions, not only about the history, but also about what's going to happen next and your views on that. So I open it up to the floor. Whoever would like to ask Michal about her work or about the presentation and her views on the matzah today. Terry, please.
Luis, did you want to go first?
No, go, you go.
I saw your hand first. So.
I know.
I
So thank you very much for your presentation. It's really insightful. And one of the elements that was brought up in an earlier session by Professor Kalir was this notion about human rights. And that was one of the last points that you made about human rights and whether or not they are explicit. What if there's disagreement about which humans deserve which rights, such as LGBTQ? So how do we address that issue about what is a basic human right if there's disagreement about what those rights should be and who is entitled to them?
Yeah, so what happened in Israel is that, again, the Supreme Court took a very important role. And as you already seen in basic law, human dignity that does not specify explicitly the right to equality, the right to freedom of speech, etc. So the Supreme Court did a very interesting thing that it read everything into human dignity. The Supreme Court said, well, human dignity is equality, because human dignity is interpreted very broadly in Israel as protecting against humiliation, but also protecting the autonomy of free will. And of course, like discriminating LGBT is something that's humiliating. Even the Supreme Court said that the exemption of ultra-Orthodox from the army is against equality, because while secular people do not have, or other people do not only secular, but other people do not have the right to choose if to serve or not to serve, the ultra-Orthodox are exempted. That is against equality as freedom of the free will. So that was the interpretation, and that's why nowadays there are some I cannot avoid my opinion that it's frightening. The amendment or the suggestion that you can discriminate people because of their sex inclination, or you can discriminate people. It's frightening, yes, but it's not. Again, it was not anchored specifically, but the Supreme Court gave a very broad. That is also explaining the suggestion for override clause to add override clause in basic law human dignity, which means that if the Supreme Court said that a law infringe upon a right anchored in the basic law, and it doesn't meet the limitation clause, means it's unconstitutional and void, the Knesset can override it, can say, well, we enacted notwithstanding that it doesn't meet the limitation clause. And why this proposal is very frightening, because they suggest that they could do it with only majority of Knesset members, 61. That means that a coalition can change the rule of the games. Again, the meaning of a constitution is that it's out of the day-to-day politics, to limit governance, to limit the governance from changing the rule, from infringing upon rights in a day-to-day politics. And what they suggest is to do it by a regular majority of coalition, that they can override a Supreme Court decision that a law invalidate, infringe upon a right by a regular majority. And not a regular majority, not 3-2, but a majority of Knesset members, 61.
Thank you. Thank you. Louis, please.
Yes, I just, I know the answer, but I'll ask it anyway. You said that the ruling on Banca Mizrahi became the Madison versus Marbury. Now that claims that the Supreme Court, basically whatever decision the Supreme Court makes becomes a landmark, namely the law of the land. So to what extent the decision of Banca Mizrahi can be used as a sort of declare that law unconstitutional, or there is no way to fight it except in the streets?
Again, in Banca Mizrahi, by the way, the Supreme Court said it, but it didn't invalidate the law, because it said that the law, this specific law, met the demands of the limitation clause. It means that it did infringe upon a right, but it did it proportionally and for a proper purpose. But later on, the Supreme Court invalidated a few laws. I think from 1992 till now, it's about 30, not laws, but provisions of laws that infringe upon rights and didn't meet the demands of the limitation clause, mainly proportionality, mainly laws that invalidated, that infringed upon rights and were not in an unproportional way, too much. And so that is the meaning of Banca Mizrahi, and that is the reason for the suggestion of override clause, because what the current coalition want to do, that if the Supreme Court says something like this, we can enact this law again and said, notwithstanding what the Supreme Court said, we said that this is okay because we are 61. Okay?
Yeah, I figured that one, guys. Thank you so much.
Any other? Yeah, Rob.
What's the status of international treaties?
Where international treaties are binding as far as they are like affirmed by the Knesset. They are part of the Israel really accept them, and the Supreme Court in its decision usually use also international treaties. I'm not an international scholar, but there is difference between different treaties, and there are treaties that should be affirmed by the Knesset in order to be part of the Israeli system. And as far as they are affirmed by the Knesset, they are part of our system.
I have a question about the politics behind a legislative attempt to control the Supreme Court. Is it likely that they will get the 61 votes, or will there be people on the other side who might break with their, with the coalition and come over and say that we are going to side with the Supreme Court here? Do they have the votes to do it?
I mean, theoretically, it can be that what happens with the former Knesset, that they lost the 61 and they needed to dissolve themselves. But this current coalition, I think they have 64. So even if someone will it's still like they need to lose 4 members to lose the majority. So I think it's nowadays it's unlikely, but because they have 64, it's relatively to Israel, it's a strong coalition relatively to the last Knesset.
Well, Michal, thank you so much for
Thank you.
sharing your work and your scholarship and your understanding of the unique aspects of Israel's legal system. It's very helpful for us in AAN as we do our work, and many of us are not legal scholars or scholars of Israel studies. So this is really, really helpful for our group. And thank you for also addressing the situation today, which we are also share your concerns and are following it very closely. We hope to stay in touch.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.